Good morning, everyone. I have the day off, so we're going to take a short day trip over towards the Mississippi River. Join me on today's adventure.
We gassed up and decided to drive into Effingham to pick up some ginger ales before we got onto the interstate. Ginger ales is one of our favorite places to grab drinks from. They have a really extensive menu of different kinds of sodas, sparkling waters, flavors, coffees, smoothies, etc. My favorite from there is sparkling water with sugar-free tiger's blood. Picked up our drinks and decided just to go ahead and get on the road. Here you can see we've made it to the Mississippi River. We are at the Chain of Rocks Bridge. I'm still learning how to use the gimbal with my phone and my action camera, so please be kind and gentle with me as I learn. The Chain of Rocks Bridge is a really interesting bridge in America. It's was located on Route 66, and there is a 30-degree turn midway across the bridge. The bridge is a mile long and is 60 feet over the Mississippi River. It was a significant landmark for travelers traveling along Route 66 when you look at the National Park Service's website. It was a massive undertaking in its day. It had a projected cost of $1.2 million, and it was supposed to be straight with a wide roadway, and there's a massive concrete pier standing 55 feet above the high water mark just to support the structure. As you can see, it's only used for pedestrians now. It's no longer used for automobiles, but it is still a fun way to get over the river and take a look. During World War II, the chain of rocks' colorful red sections had to be painted green to make the bridge less visible from the air. Um, and wartime rationing also reduced the traffic. So, to offset the costs, the city of Madison, which is where the Illinois side of the bridge is located, increased tolls. So, it was a toll bridge to 35 cents per car. Coming into view are two buildings, and they are intake water towers. So there's intake water tower 1 and then intake water tower 2. Both buildings originally helped supply water to the city of St. Louis, which was experiencing a rapid population growth during construction. They are now both classified as city landmarks and have been since 1971. But Tower Number 1 was built in 1894 and was designed by architect William Eames. It includes an asymmetrically placed turret with a conical roof and limestone facades. According to the city intake, Tower Number 1 wasn't meeting the rising demand for water in the city of St. Louis, so they constructed the second one between 1913 and 1915. The second tower also has that Roman Renaissance look to it, but it was actually had some kind of incident during construction. Part of its cofferdam was struck by an excursion boat, causing the boat to sink near the water tower. So just a little bit of history there. If I remember correctly, I want to say the intake water tower 1 actually had someone living there, but it is now currently uninhabitable. Take the Great River National Scenic Byway to Hartford to look at the Lewis and Clark Confluence Tower. The Great River Road is actually a really, really long route that follows the Mississippi River for almost 3,000 miles. It goes from northern Minnesota all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This road passes through 10 states and offers people driving on it a chance to explore rich history, the culture of the states that it passes through, really pretty natural landscape. Um, and also, you get to stop in some nice little towns that you might not otherwise decide to visit. As we got closer to the tower, we noticed that the parking lot really didn't have a whole lot of cars in it. And alas, we found out that the tower was closed for construction. So that just gives us another reason to return to the tower area and to try again. continued up the road to Alton, Illinois, and visited the olive oil marketplace, which was a really nice and cute little store that sells a wide variety of olive oils and balsamic vinegars. They even have little tasting cups out that you can use. I think we picked up several different kinds. I want to say garlic parmesan olive oil, and then I bought a bourbon vinegar and another kind of vinegar. I can't remember offhand, but it was fun. After we were done with that, we hopped over to the juice place next door and got some tea and coffee. And then we visited the Brown Bag Bistro for lunch, which was especially yummy. We sat outside on their little patio area and just enjoyed the sunshine of the day. After we ate lunch, we kind of walked down the road and visited a few different stores, including the Mississippi Mud Pottery, which has a lot of different pieces that are beautiful to look at. And you get to see him working in his workshop as well. We also went to the Mineral Springs Mall that had a lot of different like crystals and different things like that. And then when we were finished browsing the stores, we decided just to hop back on the road and travel up to Grafton, which would be our next stop. Our final stop of the day was the Grafton Sky Tour, which is an aerial lift that you're able to ride in an open chair or in a gondola. It was opened in November of 2019, and it takes you 300 feet above the bluff to Aries Resort. And there's also a winery and other fun things that you can do up there. It overlooks the confluence of the Mississippi and Illinois rivers, and it's really pretty. Um, we just enjoyed the scenery and the sunshine as we rode up. And as you can see, right now we're in an open chair, but then we opted to ride the gondola back down the bluff. And once we get to that part, you'll be able to see views of the Mississippi River. One of the fun things we saw that we would like to go back and try another time when we have more time is as we were coming back down, we saw a, a ferry for automobiles that was coming across the river. And I guess it goes over, I think, to St. Charles, Missouri. And that looked like a really, really fun thing to try to do. We just didn't know how long it would take or how long we would have to wait until we were able to come back. And they had said, I think it saves a half hour after you're off of your commute if you're going over to that area anyway. I just didn't want to have to um, drive 30 minutes out of the way or wait an especially long time as we needed to be back home. And as we get ready to disembark from the gondola, we are going to get ready to get in the car and to do the drive back home. I hope you enjoyed the video and looking in this cute little area along the Mississippi River in Illinois. Um, if you like this and you'd like to see more of my adventures, please like and subscribe. Like I said, I'm still working on learning how to use the gimbal in my action camera, but I do hope to get better as time goes and with more practice. So if you stick with me, maybe there'll be more exciting and better quality things to come. In the meantime, let your soul rest and your kindness wonder, and I will see you on our next adventure. Thank you for watching.